Hello again. So now that we've talked about the Belmont report and the studies leading up to the development of the Belmont report, let's talk a little bit more about other areas that are related to the ethical principles underlying research. First, let's talk a little bit more about obtaining informed consent. So in some studies, depending on if they're a minimal risk or considered greater than minimal risk, we actually do have to obtain informed consent from individuals. Unless you are collecting data in a public space where you're just basically observing behavior, you should typically give people an informed consent form to let them know that they're in a study and that they basically can read about the study and decide for themselves if they want to participate or not. So, in an informed consent form, we have to let participants know what the study is all about. You might not want to reveal your hypothesis and give them all the information, but you want to give them kind of a general sense of what they're going to be doing and also what the purpose of the study is. You also need to make sure that in the informed consent, you inform people about any kind of risks or possible benefits. That's usually a separate section in an informed consent. Most universities will actually provide you with a template on their website of the information that needs to be included, and that would certainly be in there. Other important information would include that participants have the right to actually refuse or terminate participation at any time. You can probably think of where this came from, right? Remember back to the Zimbardo study where we had one prisoner actually wanting to leave the study. And when he talked to Zimbardo, even though Zimbardo said that he could leave, the prisoner actually perceived it as he's not able to leave, right? And that, I'm sure, was a terrible feeling that you're trapped in this situation. So now, according to the current ethical standards, that a participant can leave at any time without any penalty. And that means that if you were promised, $15 a day, like in the Zimbardo study, you would still be entitled to that money. In a study that it's done at a university, right, usually we give course credit or there's an incentive of a gift card. You would still be getting that incentive regardless of if you actually complete the study or not. So you do have the right to leave at any time. And we also try very hard to not coerce people to be in the study. Right, we do offer incentives such as gift cards and course credit, but you always have the opportunity to get that course credit in a different way by writing a paper, for instance. And the payment or the gift card that you're being offered usually is a small incentive, so it's not too great that people would really feel swayed that they need to do this. To also make sure that the informed consent is accessible to anybody, we always have to make sure that our forms that we're using are at the 6th or 8th grade level. If you actually go in Word, there is a function under the tools that allows you to actually analyze the language that you're using, and it tells you the grade level. So you need to make sure that you check that. Just as a general rule of thumb, you should always avoid using jargon that people might not be familiar with. So kind of describe your study in the easiest and simplest terms. Okay, so once we've obtained informed consent from our participant, usually the researcher will ask, once they've read the form, if they understand everything, if they have questions. If they don't, they usually sign the informed consent. The researcher will also sign it, and then the participant is entitled to getting a copy of that. It usually also includes contact information of the researcher. Okay, so once we have obtained informed consent, typically the participant will decide to participate in the study. And one important thing that we need to talk about is the use of deception in research. So we talked about deception when we talked about the Milgram study, right? They used deception because the teacher was always a participant, but the learner in the other room, the person that was shocked, was always a Confederate. So luckily, they were actually never harmed. It was just staged. But the participant, right, the teacher, didn't know that. They actually thought that they were administering shocks to another individual that, they had sat in a waiting room with earlier. So that, of course, is deception. So deception would be actively withholding information from the participant. Um, and that's, of course, a serious concern in some cases. Why would we not use deception, right? As you saw in the Milgram study, it had the potential to really um, emotionally harm the individual that was the teacher, right? I mean, they must have felt terrible about themselves once they found out that the person, thankfully, was a Confederate and they weren't really hurt in the other room. But they must have still felt terrible knowing that they actually were capable of administering the maximum shock or, really any shock just because there was a man in a white coat standing next to them, so an authority figure telling them to keep going and to obey their orders. That must have really felt terrible for the individual, and I'm sure that stayed with them even after they left the study. Just having that knowledge that you were capable of doing that would probably not make anybody feel good. That would be obviously a major concern. A study like that would never get approved anymore today, according to our standards now. Um, but really, we need to look at alternatives that we can use instead of using deception, like they did in the Milgram study. Because obviously, some questions you can only answer in that way. So that kind of poses that question of, what's still ethical to do because the benefits of gaining that knowledge from the study outweigh the risks that are associated. So, luckily, most research nowadays actually focuses on more cognitive variables rather than emotions. So, most of the time, really, deception is not necessary to conduct research. For instance, for social psychology, rather than actually asking people about their attitudes, we now have an implicit attitudes test where people really can control their responses. So it's kind of a more pure measure of their attitudes rather than self-report, where people might actually um, change their responses based on social desirability. Of course, nowadays, any researcher that conducts research has to be aware of the ethical guidelines. So we always try to come up with methodologies that would avoid any kind of deception. And if you do use deception, right, IRB, an institutional review board, will be very carefully monitoring what you're doing. You first need to ask for permission. They will do a risk benefit analysis, and if they find that yes, you can actually run the study, they will very carefully monitor what you're doing to make sure that nobody's really harmed in any way in the study. Some alternatives to using deception would be using role-playing experiments, where you're just basically describing a situation to a participant and you're asking them, how would you respond in this situation? You can probably think of some issues with that because, if you ask somebody, they might not really respond honestly. It's probably not a satisfactory way to study some issues, but it's one possibility. Another option or alternatives to deception would be using a simulation study. The Zimbardo study, for instance, was a simulation, which would be obviously not ethical anymore today, but it's just an example of one simulation. One issue with that, of course, could be that people just get too involved, and there's some other concerns that simulation studies might actually raise. But if you can do it in a way that it doesn't harm anyone and people don't get too much into it, it might be a good option. And then last but not least, you could simply be honest with the participants and do an honest experiment where you're asking for permission to observe a naturalistic scenario. So you observe people that agree to be in the study. An example would be you could go to a place where they're doing speed dating, right? And you might ask the individuals that are there that night if you can actually film them and analyze their discourse to learn more about dating behavior. The question is, would people really, really behave like themselves, or would they modify what they're doing because they're being filmed? But that's another option that we could use as an alternative to deception. So the question is, right, is deception really wrong, right? Some researchers think that, the negative effects have been over-exaggerated, but others are really concerned about the use of deception. So obviously in the Milgram study, that would not be allowed to use that type of deception anymore in research today. But to give you an example of deception that probably would be acceptable, would be the ASH study. That's something probably you've discussed in your social psychology class. Solomon Asch studied the effect of individuals and looking at group majorities and assessing how people behave when the majority group actually agrees on something, but they actually disagree. So essentially, they were looking at how individuals yielded to or defied a majority group and the effect of such influences on beliefs and opinions. So in the study, typically they had several Confederates and one participant. They would show them the slide on the left of the one bar, and then they would say which one on the right actually closely matches the bar on the left. The correct answer, of course, would be C. But what they would do in the study is have the Confederates go first, and they would all respond with ridiculous answers. So I'd say, oh, A is true or B is true, which is clearly the wrong answer. And at first, the participant would be like, "Ooh, why are they all saying the wrong thing?" But after the majority group of the group that they were in agreed with that false answer, typically what we would see is that the actual participant would go along with that false answer. Even though they knew it was wrong, they would still go along with the majority group. So that's very interesting. Like, why do people do that, right? Even though they know the correct answer, but they still go along with what the majority of the group actually said. So this is a type of deception that would probably be okay to use because, nobody would leave the study feeling terrible about themselves because they did that. So you really have to evaluate. In some cases, the use of deception is acceptable, and in other cases, of course, it's not. All right, so let's talk more about debriefing. So, of course, informing people of what went on in the study is a very important aspect of research, not only for educational purposes because you want to let the people know what you studied, but in some cases it's actually required. So, unless you actually have an exemption for research, usually you do have to give a debriefing form. A debriefing form essentially informs participants of all aspects of the study. So once you give them the debriefing form, or you can also verbally debrief them, you have to give them information about what it is that you actually studied if you didn't completely reveal that in your informed consent. You usually let people know about the hypotheses, the variables you studied, the procedure you used, and possibly also a pattern of results that you expect. At that point, you also need to make sure that you remove any negative consequences of the procedure. So if you did use deception or you gave them some false information of any kind, you want to make sure that you let them know that you did that, and you need to let them know that that they behaved in a normal way. So making sure that they feel okay about it and that you remove any negative consequences of that procedure. The debriefing form also has contact information of the principal investigator on the form typically, or the research assistant. So if the participant has any questions later on, they have a way to get in touch with the lab so they can find out more about the study or get any questions or concerns answered. And then last but not least, if you have a study where it's actually greater than minimal risk, where you're asking some sensitive questions, such as about, depression, suicide, sexual behavior, maybe even sexual abuse or any kind of trauma, you do need to include information about possibilities for treatment or counseling. You might even offer those things yourself, but at the very least, you need to offer resources where people can go if they want to seek help from somebody. We already talked a little bit more about medical research, right? If you have a placebo versus experimental study with drugs, once the study is concluded and you do actually find that the drug has some benefits for a certain illness, you do need to offer that treatment to the participants upon completion of the study. So that's something that you are required to do as a researcher. So that information only needs to be on there if appropriate, right? Any kind of resources that people can seek out if they want to. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the different categories of review that your study can fall under. As I already told you, our study, or the studies that we do in our class, all have to be exempt research. So they have to be minimal risk, or even exempt. And let's talk about what each of these things actually means and what type of studies actually fall under the categories. So exempt research typically is research that there really isn't any risk involved. It's anonymous, such as giving somebody a survey or a questionnaire. Another example would be doing a study in the classroom where a teacher is assessing if a teaching method is effective. So it's just part of the class. There's nothing extra that people have to do. So you're just observing the behavior. You're not linking any of the information to names, and there certainly wouldn't be any risk involved. Typically, with those types of studies, you will have to submit it to the IRB because it's up to them to actually say it's considered exempt research. It's not up to you. Once they've reviewed it and they give you the exemption letter, you're no longer under review by the IRB. You don't have to renew your research even if it goes on for several years. That's something that basically you only have to notify them if anything changes to your research protocol. Other than that, you would be exempt and you could just do your research. If for exempt research, you are not required to give either an informed consent or a debriefing. In some cases, people will still actually, give either an informed consent or a debriefing or both, but you're not required to. The next category would be the minimal risk category, which means that the participant is really only engaging in behavior that's no greater than the risk involved in everyday life. Examples would include recording routine physiological data such as height and weight, or maybe even requiring them to do some moderate exercise, or observing individuals or group behavior. So it would be very similar to what you would do in everyday life, and the researcher would just, gather some information about you, but it wouldn't be anything that would go beyond that. For minimal risk research, we typically do give an informed consent, and we also give a debriefing. Although that's not always required, that's something that the IRB gets to decide. In my opinion, it's always nice to actually give an informed consent to let people know what they're getting themselves into, and also definitely give a debriefing to let them know what the study was all about at the end. And then at the last level, the greater than minimal risk research category, that will be something that the IRB will probably take several weeks, even sometimes months. They will take that much time to review because they want to make sure that we're maximizing the benefits and minimizing the risks. In some cases, they might ask you to actually modify your research. They might ask you to not use deception if that's what you're suggesting. They might suggest some alternatives to that. But at the very least, they will require you to really make sure that you're minimizing the risk to participants, that you're offering resources if that would be appropriate, if you're asking sensitive questions. And also for the greater than minimal risk category, you are going to be continually under IRB review. So at the very least, you have to renew your protocol once a year, and you have to report back to the IRB and make sure that you're still in good standing and that nobody was harmed in your research study. Okay, so let's talk about the last aspect of ethical behavior in research, and that would be making sure that you're not misrepresenting any of your ideas or your research. So one type of misrepresentation would be committing fraud. Fraud would be basically presenting data that's fabricated, that you're making up on your own, that you didn't collect from actual research participants. Typically, that is uncovered if an individual publishes something and other researchers try to replicate those findings and can't find the same findings. That's pretty devastating because that can ruin your whole career. If people find out that you actually made up your data, you could potentially lose your job. It would ruin your reputation. And of course, something else that's terrible would be stealing somebody else's data. So those would be great ethical violations. Plagiarism, of course, means that you're misrepresenting somebody else's work as your own. Either purposely, that you're actually taking somebody else's ideas, or you're doing it maybe unintentionally you're not giving them credit when credit is due. You're not citing your source. So whenever you're actually writing about somebody else's ideas because you read about them in a book or a paper, you need to give credit when credit is due. If you're putting it in your own words, you still need to put their name at the end, that this is where you got the idea. If you're taking the word verbatim, you of course need to put quotation marks around that. But in general, right, we want to make sure that we give credit to the people that first came up with that idea. That's a very important principle in research, right? We want to give other researchers the credit that they deserve. They've worked very hard, therefore we need to give them credit, right? And then in the future, once you publish your work, then people will give you credit. So you want to do the right thing and always make sure that you're giving credit when credit is due. All right, so this completes our lecture on ethical guidelines. And next we're going to do an activity that's related to what we covered in this chapter.